Recording. I didn't forget to start the recording. Hi everybody, I'm Gabby from the Clean Air Partnership. We're really glad to be kicking off this series, and we have about 80 folks registered for this webinar. Today, our presenter is going to be Jeremy Schembri from the region of Peel. We have a series of case studies coming up throughout the fall. But before we even kind of go into a lot of the presentations, I really wanted to take this as an opportunity to collect input from all of you on what you're thinking about with regards to what are the questions you have coming through your brain on governance, accountability, and what are the things you're hoping to learn from a webinar series that is really helping to support the peer sharing across municipalities on this topic that I know all of you are struggling with. So just based on that, we are going to kick it off. I'd like to do a land acknowledgements. At the beginning of all of our webinars, we always want to acknowledge the land on which we operate as the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And we recognize that Indigenous peoples are particularly vulnerable to climate change and will be disproportionately impacted by its effects. We also recognize that Indigenous people bring a really, really, really important perspective that I think is invaluable in helping us address how we are going to rise to the occasion of the climate challenge ahead of us. And I think it really brings that, if we really did bring that systems thinking that is inherent in Indigenous cultures and thinking about things in a longer term perspective that than our Western society tends to, never mind our political systems in terms of the 4-year time frame that a lot of our political systems tend to think in. If we brought that together with Western science and specialization that we've made such important gains on in the last number of years, I can't imagine that the climate change challenge would be would be really augmented by the bringing together of the systems interdependencies thinking that is inherent in Indigenous cultures and thinking. And if we brought it together with Western science and specialization and technology, I can't imagine what we would be able to achieve as a species. And our goal is that we are committed to disrupting ongoing approaches to climate governance that reproduce settler colonial relations and systematically include Indigenous people from policy making. We need that thinking and in perspective and respect for the autonomy of Indigenous lands and Indigenous peoples brought into our climate change thinking moving forward. So just before we go into the discussions and gathering a little bit of intel from you all in terms of what you're hoping to get out of this governance series, a climate accountability and governance series that we're going to be launching throughout the fall, really wanted to kind of just highlight one of the goals of the Clean Air Partnership is really to increase transparency on implementation. Where is implementation happening? What are the learnings that we're getting from it? And part of that goal was the creation of the Climate Action Atlas. It really brings together mitigation actions undertaken in Ontario. Our focus is on hunting down a lot of the Clean Air Council members ones, but it's not necessarily only exclusive to the Clean Air Council network. It is meant for anyone in any municipality to put in their action. And we really are kind of focusing in on trying to build up populate it with Clean Air Council climate action implementation. So please don't forget to submit your completed municipal or even developed on municipal. It doesn't have to be a completed project. It could be just needs to be project in implementation actions, and will help us grow this database so we can increase transparency on what municipal climate action implementation looks like. So what is the purpose of this climate governance series? Really, what we're hoping to be able to do is share existing and hoped for. It doesn't necessarily mean we have to sit ourselves and limit ourselves to existing structures. The question also is like, what structures would be more effective at supporting municipal climate action implementation across all municipal departments? Because we all know that while the climate team is in charge of coordinating it across the municipality, the climate change team cannot implement municipal climate actions all across the municipalities. It has to be implementation. There has to be implementation within municipal departments to really bring climate decision making into municipal decision making. We want to increase climate considerations across all municipal decisions because we know that there's certainly climate considerations applied to all the items in the climate action plans that municipalities have. But we also know that a lot of decisions aren't necessarily housed within the climate action plan. And we know that growth management and transportation plans and stormwater plans all have huge implications associated with climate. So the goal is to bring climate consideration across all municipal departments. And then really understand what are the climate accountability on-ramps that are kind of that are being found to support climate action implementation. And what we mean by climate accountability roadmaps is the processes, the structure. Would it be carbon budgeting, whether it be climate implications in council reports, climate action plans, the progress reportings that take place to that, relating to TCFD disclosure, a variety of different climate lenses that get applied across municipal decision making. All of those are various different on-ramps to climate accountability. And really, we want to support Clean Air Council staff members in exploring these topics by really learning from each other, because we don't have time to recreate mistakes, and we also are all looking for what works best. And then we want to figure out what the hell works. So, and why? I mean, that's also a interesting question. So really wanted to kind of speak to the reasons for the studies. What difference does governance make to climate ambition and implementation? What's the climate literacy, and how do we build that climate literature across all municipal departments? How do climate lens get applied, and how do they impact decision making? How do we support municipalities on doing that work? How do we bring quantification of climate impacts into annual budget process? How does carbon budgeting work on these questions? And what difference does it make? And then really, what does kind of like the leading practices on climate accountability look like? And then ultimately, the goal that we're doing, why we're kind of advancing all this governance and accountability, is to support implementation and creating transparency on what implementation looks like. I will kind of highlight that we've done a stronger focus on climate implementation at the mitigation and within mitigation actions. And there's less clarity, at least for myself, in terms of what climate resilience implementation looks like. And we wanted to kind of dig into that, and we will be going into that as in throughout the fall as well. So we wanted to kind of get a little bit of intel just to make sure that what we're doing moving forward is actually going to meet the goals that you actually have for what you're hoping to get out of this series. So is there one of the key questions? We're going to be going into a Menti exercise just before Jeremy starts his presentation on the approach Region of Peel is using for its climate accountability and governance. But I wanted to kind of highlight, is there a climate lead in your municipality's executive team? It's really kind of highlight someone who oversees reporting on climate and progress within the executive team. And then we wanted to kind of dig, because I've been hearing some questions from municipalities on, is it better to have is it better to have your climate team within a department, or is it better in the CEO city manager's office? And just in a couple of conversations having on this topic, really it's been coming like, I'm not sure there's a better way, but I think there's different pros and cons of different approaches. So we wanted to kind of get some intel from across the network on what are the different pros and cons, because I don't necessarily think it's a right and wrong, but it's different pros and cons. And then really what we wanted to kind of get some information from you on is what climate accountability and governance questions are running through your brain, and how you want that to play out. So I'm just gonna, before we go into anything here, I'm just gonna turn this on to present it. If you'll excuse me, I think I'm on the, oh, sorry, escape this. Sorry, I'm on the wrong slide. Gonna move that back. Gonna go here. Bear with me for a sec. And here. All right, stop this one. And I'm gonna present this. And I'm going to put it into the chat where you can go. But it's just amenti.com. And your code is 89293515. I got that right? 89293515. So if you could just go to that as well. And I'll just give it a couple of minutes for folks to start identifying that one. Oh, thank you. Perfect. It's working. Yay. Because it does seem from what we've heard from some of the municipalities that this is one of the first steps in terms of kind of governance across a municipality is creating interdepartmental teams who are where the teams are where it's identified on what each of the different departments in that team are going to be doing on their climate commitments, and how they're going to report on progress towards their climate commitments, and also what kind of supports each of the different departments might need in order to bring to advance their climate commitments. And even with regards to not necessarily, maybe let's not even if a department is not necessarily engaged directly in climate action implementation that's identified in either a climate mitigation or resilience plan, they have a lot of decisions that are within their department that have implications associated with the climate. So how do they get supported on building their climate literacy to better enable them to understand what the climate implications are associated with the decisions they're putting in front of council? So definitely we're seeing some, this is something that's kind of like becoming the norm associated with a climate governance structure. We also see that there's probably a lot of room for improvement in terms of creating more structures to enable climate change to be an ongoing item on the interdepartmental team agenda. In many ways, we also see that it's kind of like this is something that is being recognized as a leading practice and an on-ramp to climate accountability that municipalities are advancing. So thank you so much for providing that information. Just going to go to the next one. So same thing with regards to it. We just wanted to find out if there is a climate lead on your municipality's executive team. And what we mean by that is like the senior management, the commissioner levels, those ones. And is there a mechanism for climate to be on that agenda? And is there a dedicated point person who's in charge of reporting on to the executive team on climate progress and climate implications across the municipality? Okay, so we're seeing that there is some progress on this one, which is fantastic because I know a lot of you have struggled in terms of getting a climate representative on the executive team. And in many ways, this is not something that you as staff people can advance. This really has to come as a direction from council to be able to better influence the senior management and ensure climate considerations get brought into a couple of different ways. So it is something that, is something that's highlighting, but it's something that's kind of recognized that, this is something that probably what we probably would need to do is kind of highlight to council some of the leading practices on climate governance and accountability to help build awareness of this as a kind of a very clear on-ramp into climate accountability and governance. So thank you very much for that input. It kind of gives us some insight. So this is a question that we wanted to do. This was relating to, what do you think are some of the pros associated with having the climate team being located with a specific department? Doesn't matter what department. I think like it could be public works, it could be planning, it could be facilities, it could be a variety of different departments. And I think there's different pros and cons of being in different departments. We can kind of worry about those later. But just the question that you might be thinking is like, what are the benefits of the pros associated with the climate team being located within the specific department? Some of the input I've heard from, perfect. Departmental support. Yeah, I think it does what I've heard, it really helps to build more team building within that specific department. Doesn't necessarily mean it helps you with other departments, but we will get to the cons. All right. All right. Excellent. Perfect. All right. Thank you for this. It's really helpful. Now we can kind of highlight some of the cons associated with the climate team being in a specific department. We know sometimes it doesn't necessarily highlight the kind of the need for interdepartmental coordination. If you might sometimes get siloed. Oh yeah. It's like one of those things, right? I keep joking around about this. It's not technology that's our challenge. It seems to be our kind of specialization and siloed thinking that is killing us on the climate front. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Perfect. Yes, perfect. These are really good input. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, staff positions. I think that's going to still be a kind of challenge moving forward on that one. Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Perfect. Thank you so much. So now we're going to do the same thing, but now being in the CEO city manager's office. What's the good things about that? What are the pros of being in that CEO city manager's office? Yeah. Oh, quicker decisions. I didn't realize that you thought, okay, that's good to know. That's good to know. There's a more streamlined decision-making approach. Less, I guess, bottlenecks to go through. All right. Excellent. And then just a little bit of cons. And don't, we will be sharing all of this information with all of you as well, so that you can kind of get some insights on that one. Because I know that there's a number of you who are looking at kind of like restructuring, and it's kind of like where does, and having that kind of collective input in terms of the different pros and cons might be something. Just with regards to the climate team being the cons, the political pressure. Oh, I see that. What that, let me just make sure I understand that correctly. Is that the CEO and city manager's office has more in the has like council has a lot more visibility on what happens within those departments, and as such there is more political pressure on that one. Is that what the thinking was? And you could just put it in the chat, and I probably just this was set up in webinar, so I can, if it's someone who can just raise their hand if they want to, if anyone at any point in time wants to talk. Thank you, Soren. There you go. Kick it off. You could just need to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Thanks, Gabby. Yeah, I think that's a challenge where there are less, let's say, filters between council and staff, strategic priorities, like high impact, longer term planning for major programs can get interrupted by kind of quick wins or new ideas that council has every 4 years, which can be good, but can also be optics focused because obviously they want to be elected and reelected.
Yeah. And is there a little bit more pressure at the individual council level if you're at the city manager's office? Like I could definitely see how there would be more scrutiny in terms of kind of connections and communications between council and the city manager or CEO's office. But is there also an issue with regards to being in the CEO or city manager's office where individual council members reach out to staff on specific projects that they want to advance that have not been passed by council? Is that something that it could be a con associated with being in the climate, the city managers or CEO's department? And you could just raise your hand if you think that's something that's an issue, but if not, like, don't worry about it. We'll just kind of put it down as something a question to consider at some other future time. All right. And then the last question I have for you is what climate accountability and governance structures are running through your brains? What would you like to see covered as part of the series? And what are you hoping to get out of the sharings associated with climate accountability and governance and how they're playing out in across municipalities? This information will just help us to make sure that we're able to hopefully better address the hopes you have and that you're trying to get out of this series. I like it. Executive compensations tied to climate targets and progress. Love it. I should mention that's actually, that topic is on the Ontario Climate Caucus agenda that will be taking place on the meeting that will be taking place on September 20th. It brings together, just like you guys, the peer-to-peer network at the municipal staff level that is aiming to help kind of the climate champions at the council level share what they're doing at the within their municipality, some of the struggles that they're having on trying to bring more council members onto the climate team, and the executive compensation and performance measures being tied to climate accountability is something that is on the topic for municipal staff as well as for the agencies, boards, and commissions on the upcoming meeting. All right. And by the multi-capital scorecard, if someone just can, anyone, if they, oh, I'm just gonna, let's ask you to lower your hand. I got it. Soren, all good. Just with regards to the multi-capital scorecard method, is any downfalls? Is that with regards to prioritizing infrastructure decisions, and that's the structure for it? And if there's any downfalls to that in terms of impacting climate implications or climate decisions or considerations? Just so I make sure I understand that. And if anyone just wants to raise their hand, I can unmute you. If not, we will dig into it another time. All right, so thank you so much for all of that input. I am just going to share this. All right, so today's webinar, we have Jeremy Schembri he's a manager at the Office in Climate Change at the Region of Peel. And this is just Region of Peel's climate governance accountability implementation so far, because we all know our work here is not done. And I'm just going to turn it over to Jeremy. I'm just going to stop my sharing. Perfect. Thanks so much, Jeremy, for joining us today and for kicking this series off and for telling us a little bit about the Region of Peel story so far and what you've learned and where you're going next.
Great. I'm just bringing up my presentation.
Perfect. We see your presentation and just need to put it into slide. Yeah. And then just change this to display settings.
That always happens here. It's just the getting my.
Is it the trackpad? You still, I cannot use those on the laptop.
There we go.
All right. Thanks so much, Jeremy, and take it away.
Okay, great. Thanks, Gabby. And as Gabby mentioned, my name's Jeremy Schembri. I'm a manager in the Office of Climate Change and Energy Management, and I've been in the field of climate change action for over 15 years. So this conversation around governance is one that I've seen a lot of different governances over the years. I've been part of smaller groups, larger groups. I've been part of more of a top-down approach to governance, a bottoms-up approach, decentralized, centralized. And I guess I would say, before I kind of get into kind of where Peel's currently at, there's spoiler alert is like there's not necessarily one size fits all kind of approach to governance. And really, when thinking about governance, I would really strongly encourage everybody just to kind of look at the strengths of your organization and how maybe you could leverage those strengths for a certain governance. So maybe a certain approach that works at Peel might not necessarily work at your municipality because it's just the different types of structures. But it's very important for us to all to be kind of listening and learning and seeing how different people are dealing with things so that those things come to light a little bit more. And I think the other kind of key thing that I've learned, as I mentioned, all the different types of governance structures, is that just because you've landed on one, as this topic continues to evolve, so will probably the different types of governance structures that we'll have to adapt to and implement over the years. So just kind of hearing this conversation kind of made me think a little bit about that before jumping into my presentation, which is about our Region of Peel's climate change roadmap. And specifically, it's about enabling climate action. So the Region of Peel, we're doing a lot of different things from a capital implementation perspective for both reducing greenhouse gas emissions and being prepared for climate change. But that won't be too much of the focus for today. Today, I'll be walking you through what we refer to as the climate change roadmap, which is intended to help ease our implementation of our climate change master plan. And specifically, the presentation will look more closely at actions and structures and behaviors that we're trying to form within our organization so that these larger projects can be more effectively implemented. So before getting into all that, I'll just quickly give you a bit of an overview of where the region has come with our kind of climate change commitments. And I'll start with our terms of council priority, and terms is intentional because we've had multiple terms where our council has told us that climate change is a priority that they want to see tracked and they want to see reported on. And these priorities they range in number of priorities, but they're usually around 10 key priorities that our council has earmarked as things that they want the region to be paying close attention to. And so for obvious reasons, that does help in conversations internally across the organization on kind of really landing on how much of a priority climate change is. But in itself, there's a number of other priorities. So you can't, as I'll speak to more in coming slides, you can't just kind of hang your hat on the fact that, well, my topic's important, so thou must do something about it. Also supporting that kind of action, it was our climate change statement of commitment, which came from our executive leadership team. And that was, again, saying to the organization that climate change is a key issue that we have to be really focusing on. And one of the really good things that came out of that for us, even from a governance perspective, is that the commissioners in our organization had climate change show up as a key objective within their work plans, the letters that came from the CAOs, so that all staff could see those letters and see that each of their commissioners that climate change is being put on their radar as something that they should be concerned with and embedding into the way that they're running their different departments. And that had a bit of a trickle down, so that was a great thing. Unfortunately, some of that started to wane a bit with COVID, and we had to pivot a bit. So those letters I don't believe have been coming out since the COVID, but that may be coming back in the future, who knows. Like many of you on the call, we then declared a climate emergency, and that was more at a council level. Again, a great message to be sent across the organization of the level of importance of climate change, and that was followed with our climate change master plan, which outlined 5 key outcomes, which I'll speak to briefly in the coming slides, with 66 different actions about 20 actions, 66 different activities that we are going to implement to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and be prepared for climate change. And lastly, and most recently, in this term of council, the priorities have been more framed around corporate strategic priorities. And again, climate change has been ranked among those key corporate priorities. So it's very clear that message is being sent to staff that climate change is a priority. So that's important to establish when you're trying to start to set up your governance. So quickly, as I mentioned, our master plan does have 5 outcomes. We have 2 primary outcomes within our climate change master plan. And this is important just because in the governance conversation, so we had to say you have a sense of what we're trying to build to and achieve. From a reduced greenhouse gas emissions perspective, our target is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 45% below 2010 levels by 2030. And our target around being prepared is to have 100% of our infrastructure assessed against the projected impacts of climate change. I'm also just going to quickly pause. We on my terminology there around reduce emissions and be prepared. We found that oftentimes, I'm sure many on the call would probably refer to these as adaptation and mitigation type targets. But even when speaking across an organization, mitigation and adaptation has so many different meanings. So we really thought that it was important to just say what you mean. In this case, we're trying to be prepared for climate change, and that's what adaptation and resiliency is about for us. And we're trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which is what mitigation is about. And that was kind of around the communication. Definitely we've seen better traction and less conversations around like, are we trying to mitigate risk, or are we trying those types of possible confusion. So it's not really about governance, but it's something that's worked with us, and just kind of focusing on saying what you mean when you're communicating. Our other 3 outcomes, which we refer to as our supporting outcomes, is to build capacity, invest, and monitor. And these are kind of more where I'm going to spend more of my time talking today, because they really do help set the groundwork for a strong governance. And start to remove those obstacles that we run into when you're trying to implement the actions at a reduced emissions or at a be prepared level. So I won't go into too much more detail. I think it's pretty evident what I mean by building capacity and investing in monitoring reporting, but it's all as it relates to the different actions that we're doing within the organization for climate change, and more specifically around our climate change master plan. So before jumping into our governance structure, one of the key things that we've been really focusing on at the region, and myself, a key advocate for it, is change management. And a lot of different types of change management models that we look at. The one that I pulled up here is at the ADCAR model. It's a pretty well-known one, and it's fairly easy to digest. And it's important for us to be thinking about change management when we're dealing with governance and dealing with trying to get buy-in across the organization for actions, because people are at different places in their climate change journey. And I think as climate champions, at least myself over the years, we often feel, I've found that oftentimes we want to raise that awareness. We want people to understand that climate change is important. And then we jump right to the knowledge piece. And a key piece that we're missing in that conversation is the desire. And that is so critical that I find over the years, because despite even having your master plan or your priorities or all those things I rhymed off at the beginning of the presentation, when you approach staff, they're still looking at you like, yeah, we also have our own priorities, and council's also told us about X, Y, and Z, and we don't have the money and all these different things. And you're now just, you're asking me to change the way I do work, and I don't see why I want to. And we often think that it's enough just to have that stick, which is, in some cases it is, perhaps, and it does move some things to a certain extent, but I don't know that you can sustain it with the stick. I think really you do need those kind of carrots and showing people why it's within their interest to take on the climate change work and become a climate change champion, which in the end, I think from a governance perspective, the region of Peel with an Office of Climate Change is, I guess you would say, is a little bit more centralized. But in the end, our goal, and I'm sure as many of you would say in your organization, is to decentralize it. It's something that we want to be showing up in the work that everybody's doing and in all their job descriptions and things like that. So that's kind of where the roadmap is going. And that's also the intention, because we do believe once you get to that point, the implementation of this work will become that much more efficient and be less obstacles to encounter. An example of an event that we just recently did at the Region of Peel was what we refer to as our financial climate change symposium. So we had, under our CFO's guidance, which is now our CAO, Gary Kent, he wanted to bring all at the next departmental meeting for finance, he wanted a full day just focused on climate change and how climate change shows up in the work that different financial professionals do. So we brought people externally from across Ontario, industry, academic, municipal, speaking about why they have gotten into the field of climate change, even though they may have MBAs behind their names or their CPAs or different things like that, and where they see the benefit of it. And and it is no shame in not making it about just those kind of like altruistic things. Like, yes, there's certain people that want to do good and make the environment and care about the future and those kind of things. But it's also fine to also highlight, like, it might help you with your career, building your career or where you want to head in the future. And this is like kind of cutting edge work, and kind of framing things that way. Again, we'll start to get different buy-in, and that was kind of what the focus of the day was for us with the financial symposium. And we got a ton of good feedback on getting the message out from the different surveys that we conducted at the end of the session, and continue to even today, people kind of bring up different topics that were covered on that day. But I think the key thing is that we're helping, in this case, financial professionals in our organization see how it's not just an Office of Climate Change responsibility, and hopefully being a little bit more mindful about it as they're doing the work that they do. So our roadmap, our climate change roadmap consists of 5 key actions. And again, really the key piece around the roadmap is trying to embed climate change action into the work that we do across departments at the Region of Peel or across programs. So the first action would be, and I'll speak about this briefly a little bit more in the coming slides, but our level of service review, which is trying to integrate climate change into service delivery. Our energy emissions management plans, which are establishing commitments and responsibilities for actions and emissions. Our climate change infrastructure risk assessment, which ensures assets can maintain continuity of service. Our climate emergency response plans, which ensure people can maintain continuity of service. And in our climate financing strategy, which is maps the approach for what and how climate change can be funded. So this, as for some of you probably might start to see like how these different types of actions start to address some of the obstacles or might entice people to be interested in things that might concern them in their day-to-day work and why they might want to have a greater role in the climate change emergency response. But before getting into that, another key thing that we did as we approached our roadmap was the completion of an engagement plan that was focused on climate change. And our engagement plan, just as I'm speaking about in this presentation, was very much change management focused or change centric. So we recognize even with engagement, people are at different places on their climate change journey. So we did survey staff. It was more random across the organization just to get a sense of where people are at on their climate change readiness. And with that kind of knowledge, you start to build tactics for the different, how far along they are. So are they at still an awareness building level? Are they at more of the desire? Are they at more knowledge? And that does impact the type of engagement that you're going to be approaching people with. So we had a series of tactics developed for those different types of stages. We also were doing engagement for purpose. So the intent, what I mean by that is we went through the 66 activities in our CCMP and started to figure out what types of engagement, what types of groups do we need to be approaching to have success on the different activities that show up in our master plan. And we created more or less a menu for different project managers that would take on different actions and activities within the master plan to reference and be like, okay, so if I'm approaching this project and I feel that the group that I'm dealing with is more at an awareness level, this is the type of engagement that I might want to approach to start at the project versus if they're further along, it might be a different type of tactic. So we are just starting to implement the plan, and I see Mark on the call. He's working with some folks even on our team on a deep energy retrofit project within Peel and trying to bring along the team to really kind of motivate them and inspire them to achieve great things on that project. So our friend that was just looking at a board full of confusion, he's now had good engagement, is starting to see some clarity and wants to see how he can get climate change more into the work that he's doing and integrating it. And what we're kind of refer to this as a level of service review. So each program in the organization has different types of levels of service that they're trying to maintain. And oftentimes when we approach them, yes, climate change is important, but our priority is X. And what we need to have happen is climate change showing up in that priority. So that there's that integration piece into where they're seeing what they do is also climate change work. And in many cases, that's just an alignment exercise. Like for example, a program like a facility operators, they often will say like our priority, our level of service is to ensure that we have safe and secure facilities. Okay, well then how are you defining safe and secure? Does climate change show up in that? Because climate change could be a threat to your facility. And oftentimes that's kind of like the aha moment that they can have. And they're like, okay, no, I see what you're saying now. I see how climate change does show up in the work that I'm trying to do. And we just need to formalize this a little bit more so that when we're going to different levels within our government, it makes sense to them that's why we need to be requesting maybe additional budget or additional staff to ensure that it's safe and secure. And that then leads to a bit more of an ownership feeling. So it's no longer, oh yeah, I love the plan that you guys have for climate change at the Region of Peel. Let me know how that works out. They're seeing themselves now more show up in the work that that we're trying to do as a unit at the Region of Peel. We're also working on energy emissions management plans, which I'd say is probably a layer closer to the different programs. As I have the different Spider-Mans kind of pointing at each other, again, similar to what the conversations I was just describing with levels of service. Oftentimes, we'll approach folks and say, okay, we have this reduced greenhouse gas emissions target, or we have this action that needs to be implemented. And everybody seems to point at the other person to say that, okay, that's that person's responsibility, or that's what that person's going to reduce. And the master plan was written in a way that it didn't get into that level of detail, which I think was important to kind of establish first that kind of guidance on what kind of key actions and overarching goals we have as an organization. But now the time is right for us to start to drill down a little bit deeper and figure out, okay, so how do each of the different programs within our organization build up so that we are achieving those targets and don't believe that another program within the organization is carrying all that. And it also just helps with some of the other kind of key questions around, like, how much is that going to cost? Like, how are we doing some of the planning around our long-term capital planning, which we'll talk a little quickly at the end about in our climate change financing strategy. But it does give that much more clarity for the program about what they need to do over the next, let's say, decade. And they also are feeling ownership. They're part of the process of creating these plans. It's not just something that's created and handed to them. So it's no easy task, but we've had some success already. I didn't work on myself, but the other manager in our team, working with some of his staff, they did create one for our housing team. And that's looking at all the different buildings in the Region of Peel for affordable housing. So it's a huge piece of the pie. If we can start to reduce greenhouse gas emissions on our affordable housing side, we'll really start to see some traction. So this was a key step in that, and getting people on side to make movements in that area. Another one is our enterprise climate change risk financial planning and infrastructure adaptation assessment. And can I say, before I describe briefly what this is about, one of my lessons learned on this project from the onset is, when you're naming a project, do not put that many words in the title, because it does cause confusion. There's all sorts of different versions of what this project people are referring to as. So just a side note, a tip: when you're trying to name projects, don't name them like they were a journal or your thesis dissertation. Try to keep it tight and make sense, and kind of like what I was saying earlier about adaptation and mitigation. But this project is building on the FAO's report earlier. I guess not that earlier, it was like late last year, talking about how the costs of climate change to the provinces, municipalities, and more at a provincial level, that they were looking at it. We thought that was interesting, and we wanted to drill down and look more closely at how it's impacting Region of Peel's infrastructure. So we're in the process of doing this work. We're looking at the impacts and risks to all regional infrastructure posed by climate change hazards. And then the next piece is to figure out the magnitude of costs associated with adapting to climate change and still trying to maintain our current levels of service. And this is really kind of then, again, informed decision making, which everybody craves within the organization, and it helps people make some decisions about, like, are we able to maintain the level of service? Do we have to do even additional levels, like improve our level of service, or do we pull it back? It's I think such a critical exercise for us, especially from the adaptation side of things. And as Gabby noted, I think we've all made a lot more progress on the mitigation side versus the adaptation side of things. So studies like this are really going to start to show people the risk exposure to their ability to provide continuous work, continuous services, and that's really what starts to get people's attention, because it's such an important thing. Like, everybody wants to ensure that the continuity of service to our residents and businesses is occurring. And in that same spirit, so the previous one was looking at ensuring that our infrastructure is being maintained and built and designed to be resilient to climate change and allow that continuity of service. Our climate emergency response plans are also looking at it, but more from the people side of things, and ensuring like our processes are put in place that should a climate event occur, we know how we're going to respond to it. So it's looking at the different types of hazards and risks, the vulnerabilities and impacts to those types of processes, and trying to figure out like where we can be proactive and where we can be reactive. But the most critical part of this is having that coordinated response, which at the region is starting more internally and looking at kind of how even our own departments can be working together better in responding to different types of climate events, but also, which is critical, is working with the area municipalities or different utilities so that we're all kind of on the same page in how we're responding, and we can be as efficient as possible, which allows us to be as timely as possible. And again, this type of work might sound like a lot, but when working with our EMS folks, they often are already like, what their concern is more what the final outcome is, like if power went out or if flooding occurs. They're not as they don't really, there hasn't been as much concern about, okay, how does climate change relate to that? But if we can start to draw that connection for them, it just adds to people's understanding that some of these events could be better managed if we're thinking about it also from that climate change lens. And it allows for greater traction even in other places. So like, even if someone in paramedics is working on this and then they're like, oh yeah, like, wow, climate change is another thorn in our side. And then in an unrelated meeting, we're talking about charging stations. They're like, yeah, we need to do more for climate change because we're starting to see how this is impacting the way that we deliver service. So it's again, just kind of embedding that message into different people's mindsets and really having it resonate for them. And then the last action, which arguably is where the buck stops, is how does it get financed? So we're working on a climate change financing strategy, and some of it's already starting to get implemented. The key thing that's been happening as of last year's budget even is integrating climate change into budget deliberations. So when people put different business plans or business cases into budget, they have a whole section around climate change, how it's being impacted by climate change. Our office is to review that and see if, of course, if people are checking it's not climate, there is no climate change implications, we can look at it and see if that's the case or not. But even if they are feeling that there is implications, we work with them to figure out what that might look like. And it's just a great kind of checkpoint for people to be thinking about climate change in the decisions that they're making that tied to budget. But we also are looking through this strategy to account for the cost of actions and inactions, and building on kind of some of the plans that I was just mentioning, the energy and emissions management plans and the risk assessment type plans, to give us a better sense of like what kind of costs are coming up in the next couple of years, but also informing our long-term capital planning so that climate change is going to show up a little bit more than it has in the past, with some true costs, so that we're starting to budget appropriately even for the long term. And how do we do that is a key piece, because there's only so much money from some of the traditional ways that you bring money into a municipality. So we're mapping the tools and tactics for financing climate change. And again, when I say we, this is being more led by our finance group than by even the Office of Climate Change. It just kind of speaks to some of the successes that we've already started to have within Peel of getting people to kind of take the lead on some of these climate change topics, which I could already rhyme off half a dozen different projects where we're happy to be playing more of a secondary advisory support, because others in the organization have really started to see how they can be climate champions. And this is an example of that. So we're working with finance to figure out, they're looking at what types of tools they have available to them and how that might work with the climate change needs that the region will have over the next decade. And that is our roadmap. So I hope I did leave enough time for questions, and I'm happy to answer any questions people might have. And if there's anything else, Gabby.
Perfect. Thanks, Jeremy. Does that mean that you're kind of now sweating on the questions coming up for you, or that you're going to handle questions smooth like Barack Obama does?
I thought that, first of all, I'm a fan of Barack, and so I thought there's different leaders that I could put up there that might have been a little bit more politically insensitive, but I also thought like climate change, heat, take it for however you want.
Perfect. If you could just stop sharing, Jeremy, I think people would love to kind of see your face on that one. And then we can kind of, and then just in terms of anyone asking questions, there's a variety of different ways you can ask questions. You can just raise your hand. I will unmute you. Or I could just allow you to talk on this one just because we do have it kind of cut back on terms of background noise. But any questions you may have on that one? Jeremy, I think one of the key things that I know that I've heard from a lot of the municipalities is, again, the balancing between implementation, because, you know, the climate team is in charge of implementing the climate action plan, which is a big endeavor in itself. Then there's the separate effort of integrating climate across all the municipal departments and all municipal decision making. In terms of the balancing between, like, and we know that, you know, integrating those kind of conversations, building those relationships, those departments, that takes a lot of time. How have you kind of figured out, like, balancing it out between implementation of the climate action plan that's within your team's responsibility and then balancing it out to engage the municipality and the departments as a whole for them to implement the actions that are within their responsibility?
Yeah, I think that in the past it would have been probably more jumping right to that implementation and trying to get like, we have these things, let's get moving on it, and probably less attention was given to like the capacity building piece, like teaching a man to fish kind of proverbs or proverbs. So the balance maybe in the past might have been more towards trying, like, having your focus on that, but I think we're putting efforts now for more to putting in different types of engagement tactics so that the broader organization is concerned about climate change, but also then looking at a project level, getting people to have that buy-in. But I'd say part of that, though, like one of the key kind of successes for that is kind of approaching those conversations with empathy and having really that appreciation for what's making the different department or division tick, for what they need to get out of it, and showing how that can be aligned with what we're trying to achieve as well. So that's kind of a key piece that we're trying to do on on a project by project level. And I guess that's kind of what you're referring to as by more on the implementation piece.
Yeah.
But on the bigger scale, yeah, it's really kind of having the messaging not just seem like symbolic, and like the example that I gave around having a budget where you have to, it's showing up in your business cases that you have to talk about climate change, or having a day dedicated to when you're going with your department to talk about finance, and that day coming right from our CAO is they're asking for climate change to show up in everything that we're talking about that day. Like, that's really that goes a little bit beyond just kind of saying climate change is important to us. Now continue on with your day.
Yeah, that's definitely showing it, kind of putting that prioritization and words into action. In terms of the climate change financing strategy, is there information that's more publicly available to help kind of inform, like, how is that being put into play?
No, I can't say that there's like the strategy itself hasn't been completed, and there's as I'm sure everybody can appreciate, there's a lot of moving parts right now at the region appeal, and our finance department has been trying to balance all those balls in the air. So no, there's not like an actual CCFS that could be shared at this point. But I'd be happy to connect with anyone that wants to have if there's a certain, like one of those bullets that I was talking about, trying to get a sense of what are the mechanisms that you're using, or like how does climate change show up in a business case that goes to budget. Yeah, we can have those conversations.
And if there's if just in case, whenever you're ready to share in terms of kind of digging a little bit more into details on that topic, I know there'll probably be a lot of interest across the municipal network on that.
Yeah, no, definitely.
What's the mechanism to track and monitor the progress for climate change mitigation and actions at the individual departments and teams? Like, is it the climate team who is in charge of that? And then how do you kind of get them to report to you on and what are the challenges you might have faced and how have you dealt with them?
Yeah, like I think in a transition. So it has been more centric in the past, and yeah, we're looking at different utility bills and looking at how we're doing some M&V on larger projects that are being led more from our office. And then, yeah, there's some of the challenges are yeah buts and people saying like, oh, that they didn't work because X and Y, or our emissions went up. There's reasons always for why that happens. So you do have to kind of have those conversations internally. But at the end of the day, and I think we've done a really good job with this, is making people feel that it's a safe place to have these conversations, and that we're not trying to hide the truths, and that doesn't really help anyone at the end of the day, because eventually it's going to catch up to us. So just hope like it's not a kind of an accusing people of not doing what they need to do. It's just kind of highlighting where there's opportunity to do more. I think those embedded energy management plans are going to be a key piece to that, because it's starting to really kind of dig another layer deeper, and letting different leaders in our organization, this is going right up to director level, see like, okay, so this is how much, like, it's great that the region has this overarching target of 45% below 2010 by 2030, but how are we showing up in that? And maybe we are showing up as just maintaining zero, which is going to be incredibly difficult, because we're doubling the size of our paramedic fleet next year, or within the next decade. But at least, but at least it starts to all add up and show up for people to understand what kind of contribution that they can make, and they were involved in those conversations to get to that point. So yeah, that's kind of where we're headed with it. Kind of a little bit more decentralized in the reporting and responsibility. But it still is a journey. By no means can I say we've gotten there yet.
Yeah. In terms of the political support that's that's coming from Region Appeal on that one, I would guess that that's really helped to get the buy-in for engaging with the different departments. But I would guess that there's like that in itself isn't enough. Like there is that element of building that relationship and that trust with the different departments, so that they feel that they can come to you about progress that they've made, or lack of progress that they've made, to kind of troubleshoot where they go next, or to provide explanations that they could work through it. What have you done in terms of trying to build that trust with each of the different departments?
So I think part of the trust, and it goes back to my kind of making sure that you understand what makes that department tick, or it's about listening, right? Like it's you not just going into those conversations and saying you have to do this because, or I'm going to telling you like that's not how this is going to work well in the long term. But it's kind of hearing how, if they're having budget constraints in a certain department, showing them how maybe there's money here that we can help you build or do some state of good repair work and get money from FCM. And then that's kind of like, okay, yeah, we want to work with you on this, or that you're willing to help them move. Like you're not just telling them like, okay, now you have to prepare the scope of work to purchase your electric fleet. Like we're going to be there helping build that with you, but not also just on ourselves and just giving it to you, and not. So it's showing that you're bringing something to the table. And I think that's a key thing too for a lot of departments, is that they want to know that you're also showing up. You're not just like somebody pointing at them and saying that they're not doing things right, and then you run away. And the same thing goes for that you're there also in the end. Like if things didn't go right, or if things did, like, and I'm also a big fan. Like sometimes I go to the others in the area. We want to share in your celebrations too. Like we will share in if things didn't go perfectly, and trying to create that space so that people feel that they can be innovative and take some reasonable chances. But we'll take that brunt a bit too, and I think that's important that or they're not feeling that they were left out there to hang if something didn't go as planned. But likewise, as a climate change team, we also need to celebrate in the successes too. So that's something that over the years has gotten a little bit better. So like because when things go well, everybody wants to have all that attention. But and that's important for us, because we can't just always be the group that seems to be taking the fall, but not always celebrating successes. So it's that balance. But I think that does work.
Perfect. Thank you. Mark, just unmute anytime you want.
Yeah, hi, thanks. Just add to Jeremy's comments with regards to sort of moving the organization along. I think you also have to recognize that, and accept maybe some departments, some groups may not be ready, right? So
pick your battles.
Where there is momentum, and then supporting those folks that need the a little bit of a hand at the right time. That's where you put the energy, and then you show others what's possible, right? You sort of celebrate those successes, and then that brings others along. So that's another, I think, lesson learned is that there's some groups may not be as far along as others, and you just have to have patience and wait for them and encourage them, and approach them and support them where they're at.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Thank you.
That goes back to like being aware of like the change readiness as we kind of think about it in the organization. If they need to, maybe they just need to build more awareness around even why climate change is something that they should be concerned about, or just trying to figure out why it is that they aren't ready to take that leap and supporting them through that.
Perfect. Thank you. And thank you so much, Jeremy, for this kicking off this series and for giving us a little insight into the adventure, the climate change adventure in the region of Peel thus far. I did want to kind of highlight, we are recording this webinar. I will be sending out a proceedings. I'll share the PDF of Jeremy's presentation as well. I did also want to highlight that I did throw in a couple of links. Jeremy was talking about kind of like helping staff see how climate change aligns with their job. And I was reminded of the Project Drawdown. They did a really great job of identifying like climate change. All jobs are climate change, and then kind of highlighting that. And it's, I mean, while it's focused mainly on the private sector, the resources they developed, it did kind of give me an idea, like maybe this is really helpful to do for municipal staff to kind of speak directly to them about how their job is a climate job. Just throwing it out there. Just wanted to get some insights on what people might think on that one. And I did want to highlight as well that the province of Ontario has finally released the climate change vulnerability assessment, and I threw in a link for that as well. I want to thank you so much, Jeremy, for joining us, sharing the story of Region of Peel so far, and for all of you for joining us. We have additional webinars on this series coming up. I'm going to send this all into email with your proceedings, but on October 11th, we have Ash from the city of Toronto going to be speaking about how the city of Toronto is advancing its climate accountability and governance and implementation roadmap and adventure. And then we also have on October 25th, we're going to have Calgary share their story on how they're advancing their journey. We're also going to be highlighting a climate accountability toolkit that is in development right now, and we'll be launching that one at the October 25th webinar. I will throw both of these webinars in the proceedings for this webinar. And thank you all for joining us. And that email should be going out to you within the next day or two. And thanks all for joining us. And thanks again, Jeremy. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Gabby, for the opportunity.
Have a great day, everyone. Take care.